Judge Kasubhai, I want to come to you because as I looked at some of your readings and writings, your decisions, you seem to have an affinity for Marxism. And in a 1994 essay, you criticized the concept of private property, and I'm going to quote you here. You argued that, and I quote, "property incites rebellion," end quote. And this is one of the many positive statements that you have made about Marxist approaches and Marxist policies, Marxism. So a yes or no question. Are you a Marxist?
No, Senator.
Okay. Will you right now disavow the tenets of Marxism that you have praised in some of your writings?
Senator, I have not praised Marxist ideas, and I would disavow any other system than that which is than that would be supported by our U.S. Constitution and our laws.
I appreciate your comment, but sir, in your writings, you have given the opposite opinion.
I think your fellow nominees owe you a debt of gratitude because many Biden nominees have been extreme, but your record is so far out of the mainstream that you have attracted virtually all of the questions. I was particularly intrigued by your statement to Senator Blackburn that you said you are not, in fact, a Marxist. And then you said, and I wrote it down, "I have not praised Marxist ideas." Now, as you know, in law, there is the fact of evidence. And so let's go to something you wrote, an article that is entitled "Centralized Property Theory," in which you wrote, it begins, it's on the front page of your law school newspaper, you write, quote, "Intimate knowing, the lovers kissed, familiar and ever exciting, passionate transcendence, beyond the physical exhilaration lies a burning light in our limbs, our hearts, floating, flying, falling in every direction, amorphous and wonderful, time-stretching, space-curving, exquisitely explosive eros, and yet I timidly tremble every time." Now, somehow this is about property, which is not immediately evident as to why, but later in the article you write, you say, "Property is not simply a relationship between an owner and an object of ownership. Property is primarily a complex relationship between people and secondarily regards the objects people exploit. Historically, three paradigms have dominated European notions of property. Locke appealed to the notion that labor points to who has the right to exploit property. Bentham relied on utility to dictate who has rights based on how the property is exploited. And Marx was plainly disgusted with the alienation that property imposed and its establishment of an us and them and haves and have-nots. Each theory alone denies important components of human experience. Among them are the ability to work, the need for personal privacy and boundaries, and uniquely diverse desires which spin us all in differing life directions. However, the process towards integrating all three may provide a framework for relationships that enhances each unique self. The aspiration towards intimate knowing, the intimate knowing of oneself and others, is a creative struggle towards redefining property." What the hell does that mean?
Senator, when I was preparing and reviewing my materials for this hearing and for the process, I also have to admit that that writing was far from clear or articulate, and the poetry was definitely not good. Now, Senator, I don't make...
Do you believe we need to have a creative struggle towards redefining property, which is what you were advocating for?
That was something that I wrote 30 years ago, Senator, and in the course of just exploring law school and the ideas that came with...
Okay, so your flirtations with Marxism were 30 years ago, so let's go more recent. In 2020, you gave a speech entitled "Reflections on Equity and Privilege," and you said, quote, "First, the world is wide enough for all of us. Privilege derives its power from the belief in scarcity, scarcity of money, natural resources, food, and power itself. The desire to control it all drives privilege. I want to suggest to you that equity, the idea of equity, rejects this model of scarcity. Now, that's Marxism in 2020. Something else you wrote in the Wisconsin Women Law Journal. Again, this is your writing. The name of the article is Destabilizing Power and Rape, Why Consent Theory and Rape Law Has Turned on Its Head. You cited Professor Catherine McKinnon, who argued, quote, sexuality itself is a power web in which heterosexual relations per se are infused with violence and control, and, quote, most intercourse is rape. Now, her views are extreme, and yet, and when Senator Blackburn asked you about them, here at the hearing, when you want to be confirmed, you try to distance yourself from them. But here's what you wrote in the article. You embrace those views. You wrote, quote, I employ the view that rape is sex in order to focus on the significance of consent and rape law. The Sex Act is a violation per se without consent. In order to properly align the consent doctrine in rape law with consent in other areas of law, non-consent must be presumed. Do you believe that is a mainstream view, that heterosexual sex is rape?
Senator, in that article, I was exploring different ideas and theories, and I was employing the hypothetical that you've just described to try to tease out a particular issue with respect to consent. With respect to your last question...
So you also quoted Professor McKinnon, who wrote, quote, sexuality is to feminism what work is to Marxism. Let me ask you again, what does that mean?
Senator, I was summarizing different theories that people were presenting so that way I could explain them and then employ an analysis with respect to the issue of what consent was in the context of sexual assault back in 30 years ago.
I think your views are far, far out of the mainstream.
He would then abuse them, and he did this multiple times over a 15-year period of time. It started in 1997, and still with all of that information, you went far below the guidelines. And in fact, for this repeat child abuser, you recommended a sentence of just over 10 years. And he had done this to kids for 15 years. So why did you do that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I do recall the case of Mr. Gonzalez. That was a case that I believe I was assigned when I had just started in the office. I recognized immediately the seriousness of those offenses, and I believe I had Mr. Gonzalez prosecuted within a month or so of my having been assigned the case. When I make sentencing recommendations in court, especially as a new prosecutor in the General Crimes Unit in the Southern District of New York, I make those sentencing recommendations.
Okay. Well, the court rejected your recommendation. They went above you to 15 years and then gave him an additional 10 years of probation. This is something that is terribly concerning to me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to let Mr. Smith finish his answer to your inquiry.
Thank you, Chair Durbin. I just wanted to mention, particularly in the General Crimes Unit in the Southern District of New York, the sentencing recommendations that we make are in close consultation with our supervisors, considering all of the 3553A factors. And so when I appear in that forum, I'm representing the office. And I do that as a prosecutor in all of my cases. I am not speaking on behalf of my own personal views. I try to set those things aside, and I try to represent the office.